The South Carolina primary is on Saturday. And no, I'm just looking at the numbers. The Real Clear Politics average is that President Trump's lead over Nikki Haley in her home state is 31%. She says she continues on regardless. How do you see this South Carolina situation?
Well, she'll carry on in this race as long as she has the money to do so. And South Carolina's results will probably be determinative about how she can continue to fundraise. She has to be hoping for something like a profound polling error, but the scale of the polling error we would have to see in order for her to be competitive would be historic. So that's probably unlikely. Nevertheless, it's her home state. It's an open primary. Democrats and independents can vote. We've seen few indications that they are as engaged as they were in New Hampshire, but New Hampshire demonstrated that she can count on polling perhaps underestimating her performance on election day, just not to the scale that she needs to defeat Donald Trump. So the question is, how far behind is she at the end of the day? If it's a 20-point deficit, 25-point deficit, 30-point deficit, it'll be pretty disappointing for her campaign. And I don't know how she continues to raise money with those numbers. She can, perhaps, but she'd be going into Super Tuesday, which is essentially the equivalent of a national primary. Happens across the country simultaneously. Not a lot of spending to up her ID and to chip into Donald Trump's prestige among Republican voters. So that's probably the end of her campaign. Whether she makes it there is an open question, right, but she does seem inclined to make it there.
Yeah. It's been interesting. Something happened over the weekend that I wasn't planning on bringing up, but I'm sure you saw it because I know that you and I are always on X and looking at things. This producer from The Blaze was out really harassing some female volunteers that were supporting Nikki Haley, asking them if they had OnlyFans accounts, really insulting them and harassing them and humiliating them. And I thought, why are you doing this? I understand you support President Trump. Great. She's going to lose South Carolina and the March 5th Super Tuesday. And losing in your home state, that's not comfortable, right? But it happens, right? Al Gore lost his home state as well during those elections. But I sort of look at that from the Republican far right going after her supporters, thinking, why would you do that? If President Trump wants to win the election and you want to help him do that, shouldn't you just back off and let these young women do what they want to do and then maybe make the decision that they want to unite behind the Republican candidate?
So my thought while I was watching that display was that obviously this individual set out to be entertaining at the very least. But it wasn't funny.
No.
It wasn't clever. It wasn't cute. And it certainly wasn't entertaining.
Right.
It was just
gross.
An embarrassing spectacle in which he made of himself, using really crass language and being a very foul individual. And yeah, what does that advance? Even if you're not trying to advance Donald Trump's political prospects, he doesn't really need your help. But right. It doesn't advance your personal brand. And if we assume it does, we have to think about the assumptions that go into that. What did he think he was accomplishing or achieving by making himself into the most obnoxious version of himself possible? And I think there is a real, and I do think it's mostly a misjudgment, but it's not entirely unfounded. A perception on the right, particularly in the Trump era, that being churlish and obnoxious and just recalcitrant, utterly unmoved by human sentiment and emotion, those are marks of strength. The alternative is somehow weak. To present yourself as a human being capable of being rational and civil and finding yourself in mixed company and not coming off like a total jerk.
Yep.
Like there's something on the right that assumes jerkishness advances the ball, if not Donald Trump's cause, then your own, makes yourself
right.
Gives yourself a higher profile.
But also, like, sometimes
I don't understand it.
People might think, well, President Trump can be like that, right? They'll say, like, well, he fights. Yes, but he has charm and he actually can make people laugh. And even if it's a laugh at somebody else's expense, he has finesse, and I don't think he ever would have condoned such behavior. So you're right, like he doesn't need your help on that front. And if you want to help him, don't hurt him. One last question on Trump before we go to the Biden campaign, and that is, this judgment out of New York of $355 million fine for a victimless crime. Though I understand, as Trey Gowdy reminded me, still prosecute crimes even if the victim is not harmed. He was, for example, mentioning drug cases, and I thought, okay, that's a good point. But I think the Democrats don't realize that these kinds of judgments fuel support for President Trump rather than pull it away.
Well, they certainly do among his supporters. So we haven't had really any polling around the civil fraud judgments that Donald Trump has been experiencing or has been on the receiving end of recently. But we do have polling around the criminal charges, and they're really static as far as what we've seen for YouGov polling from December to now, early February. Republicans roughly believe that these charges are unfair and have been unfairly prosecuted, roughly 70-20. It's the mirror image among Democrats. Roughly 10% think Donald Trump has been treated unfairly. Everybody else on the Democratic side is convinced that these are wholly justified verdicts. And independents are split. 30% think it's unfair, 40% think it's not. And none of that has moved over the course, despite, environmental conditions changing wildly. This opinion has not changed at all. So I'm hesitant to judge these verdicts as harbingers of some sort of epochal shift among voters within the electorate. They seem to have been relatively priced in.
Right.
This particular verdict, like the scale of this verdict,
yeah,
he'll have the opportunity to appeal, and it is really large. I mean, it's designed to be to prohibit Donald Trump from doing the kind of conduct that Judge Endergan decided that he was untoward. So he said in the sentencing, or we're dropping down this verdict, that, quote, they're being the defendants, Donald Trump and his sons, their complete lack of contrition and remorse borders on pathological. Quote, defendants are incapable of admitting the error of their ways. Now, obviously, they wouldn't admit the errors of their ways if they believed themselves to be innocent.
Right.
Nevertheless, a judge is at liberty to hand down really excessive verdicts that might be overturned on appeal just by virtue of the conduct of the defendants in court.
Yeah.
That is not unusual or unreasonable. So while this might energize Republicans, everybody else who isn't on board isn't necessarily going to come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, I have to say, I cover this stuff every day. It is very hard for me to keep the threads all together on all the different court cases. It's very confusing. So just stick around for the end. Yeah, let alone people who are just trying to live normal and wonderful lives where they don't have to think about this stuff all the time. I want to ask you about the Biden campaign because I felt that the Robert Hur report was really a turning point. And this is the report about he's a special counsel, and he's the one who said Joe Biden will not be charged for the crime of having these illegal classified documents in his possession. He said there wasn't enough evidence for that. But he also said, in addition to that, even if we were to bring charges, the jury would see him as such a sympathetic character, as an old man with a poor memory, that we couldn't bring the case. So fast forward. Then you had over the weekend, I thought pretty remarkable how many Democrats are now saying out loud what was being whispered about before, which is concerns about President Biden's age and abilities. You had Charlemagne the God, who is a popular DJ, go on a Sunday show to express his concern. Now, it's not like he likes the Republicans at all. And if you listen to the full interview, he was quite damning to them as well. But in addition to that, you had Ezra Klein, who used to be with the New York Times, or maybe is he still? No, he's with Fox. And he has quite a big platform for Democrats. And he was saying that Biden should step down. What do you think of people who still imagine that Biden is going to either step down or ultimately won't be the nominee?
Well, I sympathize with them, but I frankly think it's too late. The opportunity to do this, to seamlessly transition Joe Biden out of the role, would have been years ago, probably after the 2022 midterms. I was always of the impression since 2021 that Joe Biden would be the Democratic nominee for two reasons. One, because the parties are too weak. They're incapable of muscling an incumbent out and overcoming their historical memory, the sort of institutional memory of what happens to parties that sacrifice their incumbents. It's usually not very good. So the forces arrayed against extirpating Joe Biden from his situation. Plus, on top of that, Kamala Harris is performs dismally in polling. But circumstances are changing radically beneath our feet with this increased number of Democrats who are coming out and giving voice to the apprehensions they've probably held all along. They just now feel like they have a safe harbor. And it's created this sort of perhaps rationalization on their parts, but one I find convincing, that maybe Democrats would be better off with Kamala Harris. Like, think about it. Think about what would happen the day after Joe Biden defers. He would have to resign. He wouldn't. There's no way to force him out. Even the notion that the convention would somehow devolve into some sort of a fractious internecine feud over how to get Joe Biden out of the role. That's just fantastical. He would have to abdicate. But if he abdicated, what would the media environment look like in the next week at least? I mean, Kamala Harris would go to work demolishing all the false praise that she would be adorned with, but she would be festooned with praise for her historic presidential nomination, the potential history that she would be making as the first female president, and all the enthusiasm that Democrats lack for Joe Biden would be artificially created for Kamala Harris. Would it last? Probably not, because she would open her mouth rather quickly and disabuse everyone of the notion that she was the figure that she had been made into by the press in their effort to build her up. But they would try to build her up, and it would shake up the dynamic of this race significantly. If Joe Biden's biggest liability is his age, and it is, and Donald Trump has a liability in his age, though it's not his biggest liability, that would neutralize a big problem for Democrats right away. Again, I don't see this happening.
I know, but it's fun to think about.
But it is fun to think.
It is.